And we are back on the Zero Hour. In this segment, we're going to take a somewhat longer view, both forward and backward in time, and explore the notion of why we fight over territory. Our two guests have published a paper entitled Grounds for War, The Evolution of Territorial Conflict. With us now to discuss their paper is Professor Dominic D.P. Johnson. He is Professor of International Relations at the University of Oxford, and his co-author, Monica Duffy Toft, who is Professor of Government and Public Policy at the University of Oxford. To both of you, may I say thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Oh, you bet. I think you've written a very interesting and potentially important paper, and I wanted to ask you a bit about it. You've explored the history of human conflict, territorial conflict, and suggested that this is, in fact, not a hardwired behavior, but certainly a historically human as well as animal behavior that might explain some current events as well. Now, I'm sure I've misrepresented the subtleties of your position a little bit, but could you give us a brief summary of your paper with that in mind? And correct me where I've been wrong?
Okay, let me start. That was a good summary. It's not hardwired, but our observation is simply that territorial conflict is in no way unique to humans, and in fact is found across the animal kingdom. So it's something about biological organisms, and we're no different.
Okay, well, if it's, I guess, the number one question, and you are both in the government and public policy area, not the evolutionary biology field, for example, but I guess the obvious question people are going to be asking is, well, if it's not hardwired, why would we do it? Why would this be a human habit that's evolved as well as an animal habit that's been in existence for so long?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one possible answer is simply that territorial behavior is a good strategic solution to a common problem. So it might be that we haven't necessarily inherited it, but we've come to the same conclusion about the best way to deal with territorial conflict, just as many other animals have. And in the paper we talk about evolutionary game theory and the idea that a good strategic solution to defending resources is in certain conditions, territorial aggression. So it might be that we're all facing a very similar problem in its essence. Of course, the details are different. In the human case, it is much more complicated. There's lots of other things going on as well. But the fundamental problem is the same.
You know, I find myself navigating a little semantic minefield here in the sense that I don't want to say, for example, it's an instinctive response because that suggests hardwired. However, one tends to, and perhaps Professor Toft, you can add as well, but one tends to, you use the word proxy, for example. So what comes to mind then is that if territory is a proxy for resources, and let's say an invading army takes the hill next to my home, I have a reaction, a very negative reaction. I don't think, well, that will make it harder for me to forage for berries now. Let me find another strategy for berry accumulation. I just think I want these people off my land. Is that kind of a fair description of what we're talking about here?
Well, so this is Professor Toft talking. So I think Dom and I, how we put it in the paper, and we would say it just raises the risk. So if territory is involved, so it's interesting that when you said my land, right? And so there's just something about, when we talk about residency status, we talk about who's lived there the longest, which organism, which human knows the territory, knows the land. And so, one of the core features of the argument is we say there's a higher risk when a piece of territory is the subject of contestation between the two organisms or between the two people. And so it's not that we're hardwired, and then even with the soft wiring that we talk about, all we're saying is that when territory is involved, it just means the risk is higher. There's a higher propensity for humans to sort of go all out and try to defend that territory, or to take it if they feel as if it were taken and they still are the rightful owners of it.
So let's take this and talk about this notion of evolutionary game theory here. How can this be used to help us? I mean, I was always struck. I was a little boy when the movie Exodus came out, and the theme song, the first line is, "This land is mine. God gave this land to me." That's how it begins. And then you have, you have Palestinian culture deeply steeped in the notion of the Nakba and the displacement from land and home. You have it in Chechnya. As you both cite in your paper, you have the situation that's taking place now with Ukraine and Crimea. So how could we potentially use these insights to deal with some of these seemingly intractable territorial conflicts?
So I'll start, and then Dom, do you want to take over? So I'll just explain how I came actually to this research. So Dom is trained as an evolutionary biologist, and I'm trained as a political scientist. And it's interesting because the couple of cases that you just talked about, RJ, involve nationalism and homelands. And so I came to this by way of looking at nationalism, and when it is that ethnic or ethnic groups or nations sort of fight over territories or fight over particular pieces of land. And so one of the things that we can help to understand is why is it that particular pieces of land are contested more so than others? So why is it, for example, that Russia most recently went after Crimea? And why is it that the Chechens for hundreds of years have been trying to expel sort of Moscow, trying to come out from underneath the Moscow yoke? And so what Dominic and I can do through this theorizing, using the game theory, using sort of the hawk-dove, and what we mean by hawk is, you're taking the offense, you're really fighting for the land, and the dove is sort of yielding and saying, maybe the other side is going to be able to contest it. And we have some conditions. It depends upon costs. It depends upon the sense of whether or not you're going to be able to actually win, be victorious in the fight. So we're not saying, cut and dry, but what we can do is point to particular parcels of land around the globe that are going to be contested much more so than other pieces of land.
So and then of course Professor Johnson will want to hear from you. But the one that always astonished me was the Falkland Islands. Here you had Great Britain, so many miles away, and Argentina fighting over this remarkably tiny piece of land. The cost seemed so disproportionate to the land involved. Isn't symbolism a big piece of this as well?
Yeah, so that's a good topic and a good point to raise here, because as Monica said, what led us into this was partly the recognition that the literature trying to understand territorial conflicts had failed to some extent to explain both the prevalence of territorial conflict around the world and its severity. When it happens, it's very bloody. And people hadn't really been able to explain this other than sort of saying, well, there seems to be a sort of symbolic factor here which people place on territory. But that just begs the question, well, why do they place this heavy symbolism on territory? And evolutionary biology sort of suggests that that's not particularly puzzling, that it can be a good strategy to do that, to place a high value in the territory that you know and you own, and to fight for it to keep it. As soon as you come to a specific case like the Falklands, there's all sorts of historical and political and socioeconomic factors which come in. Lots of British people were surprised about that decision. We need Margaret Thatcher here to help us work out exactly what happened. But part of it is a bit like Crimea. It's about the people who live there and what they want. And in the case of the Falklands then and now, there's been an overwhelming demand among the people there to stay part of Britain, however crazy that looks from the map.
So you have this sort of endless fractionation. I mean, that's a principle we all admire, that self-determination, but then you have, for example, Ukraine versus Crimea, and you have Crimea per se versus the Tatars in Crimea and so on. So you have this, you could have this endlessly fractionating process of self-determination. I guess the question in our closing couple minutes or so is there a way this can be used to minimize or prevent conflicts in the future?
Well, I'll close with one point. I think it can. I think we can talk about sort of fractures on the globe. I mean, it's interesting if you look at the world. We do still see a proliferation of states. Back in the late 1940s, there were only about 50 or so states, and now we're upwards over 200. So the fracturing is still happening. It's happening less violently. The Soviet Union fell apart relatively peacefully, but I think it can help us to sort of mitigate and understand, to really fully appreciate the emotive power. I think we're advanced, we're modern. I mean, Kerry talked to Secretary of State. Kerry talked about this is 20 or 19th century behavior, but to understand this emotive power behind territory and this compulsion for humans, for people, to say, no, this is my land and I'm going to fight for it. So just that awareness, I think, is helpful, and bringing that to the fore when these crises happen, and take it seriously.
And I think you're also saying, to a certain extent, respect it. That either side of a conflict can say, I understand you have a territorial reaction here, and I will take that into consideration in my handling of this going forward. I hope we've done justice to your topic and to your paper. Thanks so much for being with us, Professor Dominic Johnson and Professor Monica Toft. We really appreciate you coming on to discuss your paper.
Well, thank you. It's been fun.
Thanks very much.
You bet. I'm Richard Eskow, and we will be RJ Eskow, and we will be back after these messages to talk about the Hillary campaign in 2016 and more about the McCutcheon decision with Ryan Clayton of Wolfpack. So please stick with us. We've got a lot more to cover. I'm Richard Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.